Hey there, you're listening to Paradigm Shift, a podcast about people building the future and pivotal moments in their journey. Today, we're super thrilled to have Elad Gil on the show. Elad is an entrepreneur, investor, and operator, and Zain and I like to refer to him as the GOAT of solo capitalists, which is a movement here in Silicon Valley. He's an investor in companies like Airbnb, Airtable, Coinbase, Deal, Figma, Gusto, Rippling, and the list goes on. Really countless, very generational companies. He's also the co-founder of Color Health, and before that was an executive at Twitter after it acquired his company Mixer Labs. And finally, you might be familiar with his book, High Growth Handbook, which is a favorite among the founders that Zain and I know. And Elad also regularly blogs on his blog. He hosts a podcast called No Priors. And he shares great updates on Twitter. So with all that said, welcome, Elad.
Hey, thanks so much for including me today.
So I would love to start at the beginning of your career. Of course, looking back, the trajectories always make sense. They make perfect sense. But I noticed that your background in your early years is actually quite diverse. You studied, biology and mathematics, among other things, in undergrad. Then you went into the business world you were consulting, and then you went to startups. I'm just curious, when you reflect back on that, what were kind of the interests that were drawing you in these directions? And were there any threads that, now looking back, you see that tied, those various activities together?
Yeah, I think in my core, I'm a technology optimist. I think, like any field, there's always bad things that bad people do or whatever. But in general, I think technology is a force for good that's really pulled hundreds of millions or billions of people out of poverty and despair in different ways over the years or over the decades. And so in general, I've always viewed technology and biotechnology and all the rest of it as things that can fundamentally help society if applied properly. And so that's been the big motive force for me, is just I've always been interested in the underlying tech, and then, what does that mean for people and how can it impact them in positive ways?
That's amazing. I feel like optimism is implicit in a lot of the work we do, but it's great that you spell that out and call that out as a motivating factor.
It's kind of weird because it kind of gets poo-pooed a bit now, particularly, in the press, or you can't say, yes, I think technology can be very useful for people and a very positive force, and everything has to be caveated now. And so I feel like perhaps the pendulum has swung a little bit too far in the direction of people not being able to say that. And I think the reality is that there's still a lot of true believers who move out to Silicon Valley or to New York or London or Tel Aviv or wherever, in Bangalore, et cetera. And they just want to do things that are really useful, and they're very excited about technology and its applications to the world. So I think there's more people like that than people think. It's just, for some reason, you can't self-admit it as much anymore.
If we look back at the last 30, 40 years, tech has been like a huge rising tide, right? It's grown a ton. It's created a ton of impact. It's almost unquestionable, the impact and the reach and the penetration of modern tech, from the internet to mobile and so on. So on one level, it seems obvious that, of course, there's reason to be optimistic, and it's been this rising tide. But at the same time, the sentiment seems to have changed. So why is that? Do you think people question whether tech continues to be a rising tide? Do you think that's the undercurrent here? Or do you think it's just people are jaded by some of the news we see? What do you think is really going on?
Yeah, I would actually broadly define tech as more stuff than what you just mentioned. It's not just digital technology and computation. It's the Industrial Revolution. It's agriculture in terms of high yield crops, reducing famine. It's the automotive industry used to be the technology epicenter, right? Detroit used to be the hub for technology startups, and there were hundreds of automotive startups all sort of cohabitating at the same time there. So I think from a broader, deeper, longer term perspective, technology has been this motive force to raise people out of poverty, out of famine, out of a lot of really bad things. And I think what happened is there's been sort of the emergence of two or three trends. One is, for a lot of people, life has gotten so good that they don't realize how bad things are, and therefore why technology has helped so much. And so if you look at Our World in Data or other sites that sort of collate data, and you ask who thinks the world is getting better, it's the poorest countries that think that the world is getting better, and it's the richest countries where the average person thinks it's not. And that's because they don't see the relative changes as deeply because their lives are already so good, right? It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Your base need is you just want food and shelter. And then eventually at the top, there's like self-actualization and maybe like being on Twitter or something. I don't know. And so I think like, as you move up that hierarchy, you both don't see the dramatic changes due to technology, but also you just become very cynical and perhaps a little bit entitled in terms of what your life is like on a day-to-day basis and what is meaningful versus not, or what is hard versus not. There's been this rise of fragility. And so I think one of it is just times have been so good for so long that people forgot about war and they forgot about famine and they forgot about the inability to get an education or access information or do really deep things. And there's still lots of people around the world who suffer from those things. And those are the people who are the most optimistic about the world, if you actually look at global polling. So it's kind of interesting to see that contrast. So that's one thread. I think there's a second thread where, as organizations in tech have gained market share and market cap and power, some people have just knee-jerk said, well, we have to counter that. And so we have to bring those people down a peg. And then lastly, I think on a global basis, at least in the 20th century, there have long been these battling agendas of abundance versus scarcity. And scarcity agenda keeps changing the reason why we need scarcity, but it's always the same net result of we should limit everything. We should limit energy productivity. We should limit the number of children you have. We should limit technology investment. We should limit. And, there's a book from the late 60s. I think it's called like The Population Explosion, or I can't remember what it's called. It was a Stanford professor wrote this book about how the world was going to get overpopulated due to population growth. And the world, it was claimed in the book, would tip into global famine in the 70s and 80s. And it actually turned out, if you look at the data, the 70s and 80s were the most famine-free decades in like much of human history, right? But this person was saying the same things you hear now in terms of what people say around climate, around you shouldn't have kids because of the impact of that. And you shouldn't do all these things because the world is going to get much worse. And so it's a very old agenda. And I think technology is sort of in a countervailing agenda, which is this abundance agenda, which is saying, how can we reduce the price of energy as much as possible because it's an input into everything else that humanity does. And, how do we think about technology to apply to big problems today, like decarbonization and climate or biotechnology and drug development? And how do we expedite that so that people have better access to better healthcare at lower prices, or certain aspects of AI? And so I do think these are warring agendas. And people don't explicitly call them as much, but I think, these are very old concepts and trends, or at least by old, I mean 20th century. And I think we're only going to see the acceleration of these two viewpoints of the world colliding. There's actually a very good comic that, it shows two people talking. One of them says, I'm really worried about climate change. We should change our socioeconomic system. And the other person says, well, here's a folder on nuclear and how that can address climate change. And the first speaker sets it on fire and says, I don't want to talk about nuclear. I want to talk about changing our socioeconomic system. And so I feel like there's a lot of those types of undercurrents in these conversations that aren't made explicit, but they're really what's happening in the background.
Do you feel like there is an opportunity for the way that, as technology companies and the industry broadly encounters more like regulated, slow-moving industries, is there like an opportunity to reframe the way that, progress is discussed or success is discussed, or like reframe the narrative around this? Like, nuclear is a great example where I think a lot of people looking at the numbers might understand like, okay, this is actually a very safe source of energy and it's wonderful for society, but you're warring this narrative, which is so like emotion based and like it's it almost feels like there's a branding problem. You know what I mean? It's like we're like the surplus and the benefit to society is not being properly framed. But I don't know to what extent that seems like an opportunity to you.
Yeah, and that marketing issue or that PR issue was purposefully started in the 70s. So if you actually look at Pew market research around whether people supported nuclear or not, it flipped in the 70s in part due to some coordinated action between the environmental lobby and big oil, right? Basically wanting nuclear to not really continue to thrive as an industry. In the US, we're still at 18 to 19% of all of our power generation is nuclear. France is at 70%. Japan pre-Fukushima, there's one person who died in Fukushima directly from the nuclear incident following a tsunami and an earthquake. That curtailed Japan nuclear investment, although they're now saying they're going to go back to their original plan, which was to get to 50% of their power generation being nuclear over the coming decades. And so, it's actually reasonably broadly used and quite safe, to your point. And so the question is, why is the perception so strong, and why is that perception constantly being reinforced? And what agenda is that serving? Like, if you're really concerned about climate, why are you anti-nuclear, right? Greta Thunberg actually came out recently and said that Germany shutting down nuclear power plants and burning coal instead is a mistake, right? Like, how can that be a good energy agenda? And so you see these sorts of things, and then you have to say, well, people are clearly not looking at data. And usually when you're not looking at data, that means you have a different agenda that you're pursuing. It's not about the actual question that the data is about. It's some other question that's driving it, right?
Yeah, it's funny. If you, in all these things, tech optimism, energy, if you look at the data, it's like so indisputable, right? It's just like so obvious, like it just hits you in the face. And yet there's so much noise and just like, clouded conversation that it's very strange. But zoom it out a little bit, jumping back to your sort of journey into investing and building. You've had such an incredible run, starting with to some extent Google, it seems. So we'd love to just wind the clock back a little bit and hear if as you look back, if there have been some key moments or some key lessons over the years or across those early phases of your career that have driven how you think about what you're doing now, which is investing.
Yeah, when I moved out here, I moved out here to join a startup. That startup eventually imploded. And then I consulted to a couple companies. And by consulted, I mean I basically was working for hire. And some of them tried to convert me, but I decided not to do that. I eventually joined Google. And at Google, I really worked on two things. One is I helped get the mobile team up and running and acquire Android and all these things. And then two is I worked on large scale ML and AI systems on the ads targeting side from a product perspective. And, I think that AI was one of those things that was clearly extremely useful in the context of Google. Google was the world's first AI first company, right? Even in its earliest days. But there's been this long thread of thinking that AI will someday really impact the world. And, it did for big companies, but didn't really for startups until quite recently. And now, of course, we have this very exciting wave of generative AI, which I think is sort of the next big platform shift or the next big paradigm change in terms of how we think about software. And it's always interesting to look at some of the early concepts that existed, 15 years ago or 20 years ago that are now actually substantiating into real world products. And there was kind of something similar that happened before that in mobile, where if you looked at the history of mobile, a lot of the things that we defined that would occur due to mobile were defined in the 90s, right? In terms of the different things your phone could do and the capabilities and the information you'd have available and all this stuff. But they just didn't have the hardware and the ability to build the devices, right? It was a technology gap, not an idea gap. And then there were some ideas that never really became obvious until mobile devices were reasonably widespread. And then you had things that you wouldn't have been able to predict. You click a button on your phone and a stranger shows up in a car and you get in and you feel fine with it and they drive you somewhere, right? Like Uber was not a priori something you could predict, but mobile messaging and photos and all this stuff were. And I think the same thing is going to be true of AI, where there was very specific things that 15 years ago people were talking about that are now substantiating themselves and are sort of the obvious things to do. And then I think there's going to be half a dozen non-obvious things that will just kind of emerge that, will only emerge once you have enough users and people trying things and iteration.
Yeah, just to go a little deeper, what are some things that you think are obvious that are starting to happen now that maybe weren't possible in the past?
I think there's a few aspects of it. I mean, one is people have been talking about NLP for a long time. And now we have real NLP, right? We actually have natural language understanding of text and, the ability to synthesize concepts down and distill them, the ability to generate text, the ability to understand and reformat data easily and run regexes, and you just describe what you want the thing to do. And, a lot of the things that people really struggle to do with the sort of old school CNN, RNN, et cetera world, I think now works in an incredibly performant way with large language models, right? All the transformer-based models. So I think there's a lot of stuff like that almost kind of worked for a while and now works extremely well. There's things around voice that I think, are very old concepts around universal translation and, real-time dubbing or translation and things like that are starting to happen now, which I think are super exciting. So I think there's a couple things like that where you're like, yeah, of course, this stuff is going to happen. And then there's things that have been talked about in a lot of sci-fi books that haven't quite happened yet that are probably coming in terms of, it's sort of like the that book by Neil Stephenson, The Diamond Age, where every person has sort of like an AI that will educate them. As a child, it'll help them, learn at their own pace and grow and develop. And that raises all sorts of interesting societal questions around who's going to control that AI in terms of what it actually teaches your kids and how does it teach it and what's appropriate versus not, and what cultural world viewpoint do you actually want to have for your child. In different countries, people might have very different perspectives on what they want their kid to learn and how, and what social norms they want them to have. And so there's really interesting questions raised there in terms of if you have companies based in one country providing these tools for other countries, how do they impact those cultures over time? And we're already seeing that in other ways through Hollywood or media and other things. But I think this really accelerates it, because if your child has a bot companion from birth who's teaching them different things, some of the things that it may be teaching is social norms. And then the question is, what social norms do you want? And are you okay with what that bot teaches them? So I think there's all sorts of stuff like that that's coming that's going to be super interesting.
Yeah, there's so many. We have an AI on the agenda. I'm so excited to talk about it because there's so many different angles to consider, from the business model perspective to the regulation to different types of like data network effects. Before we get there, though, I would need to ask you a few questions about your investing, because you're very modest. So I'm sure you wouldn't say this yourself, but your track record is like absolutely like it's outlier, like multiple standard deviations out, and you've invested in like a large number of generational companies, which we mentioned at the top of the show, just a part of those. I have two questions. The first is, though, like, what do you think has contributed to your outlier success? Like, in what ways do you think you're doing things maybe a little bit differently? And then I can follow up with another one after you've answered that.
I think part of the reason I was lucky enough to get involved with some of the companies I got involved with over time was, number one, I just started investing at a good time. It was a moment where mobile and social and the cloud were all happening. And there were just very large opportunities. And the founder ecosystem was smaller. I mean, it was still quite large, but it was much smaller than it is today. And the trends were really obvious, and so you knew that payroll sucked and all you had was ADP and paycheck. So a modern solution had to emerge. Or you knew that, payment processing sucked. And so, what's the modern solution for that? And so I think that some of these things at the time maybe were viewed as a little bit contrarian or weird, or can't you just use Braintree or whatever? But as a person building a company at the time, there was things that you just needed that didn't exist in a performant way. And so on the one hand, I think certain aspects of investing were easier than they would necessarily be now. I think the second thing is, and for example, I got to the generative AI wave quite early, I think, on a relative basis. And I think a lot of that was just driven by, again, being technology first and caring about technology and having worked on ML systems in the past. And so I'd already been playing around with GANs for our generation just because I thought it was neat. I was really paying a lot of attention to GPT-2 and 3 because it seemed like a new type of functionality. And so I just started getting involved with a lot of the early companies in this wave of generative AI quite early, simply because I thought it was really interesting and really useful, So I think sometimes if you're focused on technology and you're focused on the building side of things and what's interesting, then I think you end up with maybe different answers than if you're, just trolling for like investments or whatever.
It sounds like your personal passion and experiences starting companies and so on guided your understanding of problems and ultimately some of your investments. How much of that is just like things you had felt as a problem that you then invested in, or things you were sort of intrigued by and thought were cool that you invested in? Are there a couple of heuristics here that have sort of guided where you've ended up sort of focusing in terms of like companies you partnered with or investments you made?
Yeah, I think in general, I tend to be much more product market driven than most people at the earliest stages. And so I care a lot about, is there a product that people want to buy or use versus, hey, I really like this founder, they're really smart. And obviously, I think founders are incredibly important. I've started two companies myself, but it's more just, I think a lot of early stage people are focused on the, hey, is this a smart person and do I like them versus, hey, are they building something that a lot of people want? And I think in general, there's been a real dearth of commercial thinking over the last couple of years. And I mean, commercial thinking in a good way. It's sort of like the Steve Jobs viewpoint of the world, which is I need to build a great product, but then I need a great business model. I need to cut good deals around it, and early Google was kind of that way too. They're like, we need to make money eventually. And how are we going to do it? And, what is our business model? Those sorts of questions were actively being asked. And so I think there's this sort of mythos of, hey, if you just build a great product, everything will work out. And that matters a lot more than just being business centric at the beginning. But the flip side of it is I do think that a lot of the really great product and technical founders eventually adopt strong forms of commercial thinking if they're the founders who take it to the next level. And that's when you have like a Bezos or a Larry and Sergey or a Zuck or, the Stripe founders or other people, right? These were all people with highly technical backgrounds who ended up then also being very smart about thinking about what's a business.
Yeah, let's jump into a few examples here, just because that's always really fun. So when you got to Google, were they making money? Did they have AdWords figured out in AdSense? I'm just curious, or were they kind of like?
Yeah, they had AdWords and they were ramping it, and AdSense was there and it was a new thing, but it had been ramping, and so yeah, at that point they had it figured out. But I remember, I was working for somebody initially who was employee number 9 at Google, and he'd started off there as an engineer. And so he would tell me all the early stories, and he'd worked on when Google basically went through 3 or 4 business models, right? First, they tried to syndicate out search and charge for it. So they'd literally get paid per number of queries. And then they tried to build enterprise search appliances. And they had this piece of hardware. It was like this yellow thing that would slide onto a server rack that was like enterprise search. And then they, I think their third business model was AdWords or something. They took like a couple iterations, right? Where they made big bets on business models. But throughout, they were trying to figure out how to make money. And so I think they started thinking about it pretty early, And it's funny because for the next decade after Google, there was time after time, big consumer companies built that people would question the monetization of. And I never understood it because, Google and others proved quite early on that if you got to very large audiences, you could monetize via ads and in some cases via subscriptions, like what Netflix did eventually. And for some reason, you'd have YouTube come up and people say, oh, they'll never make money on YouTube. Or you had Twitter. I remember when I was at Twitter, people say, oh, Twitter will never make money because I sold my company to Twitter before they really started monetizing. And you're like, of course they'll make money. If you have hundreds of millions of users, you're gonna be able to make money. And so in the early days of certain types of companies, thinking about monetization is way premature, right? The only thing that matters is getting to scale, because if you get to scale, you can monetize. But eventually you do have to build a business in addition to building a product if you want to be a standalone.
Yeah. And I think even some of the companies that got to scale actually proved out the business model much earlier. Like Facebook was making a few $1 million long before they grew out of Harvard even, for example. And so I think that's sometimes forgotten when people look back. So that was really fun.
The biggest companies are almost exclusively incredibly capital efficient from early days. If you actually look back at it, you're like, wow, the companies that ended up with these massive market caps ended up being very capital efficient companies. And that in part could mean that they're in a really big, good market early, or it could mean that they were just run really well, or it could mean, again, that maybe the founders were willing to think commercially early. And I'm not sure if it's all those things or if it's a subset, but if you actually look at just market cap, you can look at it relative to capital raised over time, and it's always the capital efficient ones that do the best.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I'd love to do 1 or 2 more of these examples. So maybe we can just hone in on when you partnered with Clipboard Health, because we had Weedang on the show. Our listeners, the ones who listened anyway, are familiar with that story. So what did you see with Clipboard early on? Because I know they're building a marketplace for nursing. Probably not a segment you had personal experience in. How did you sort of evaluate the commercial potential, or what did you see? And would love to just hear your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I'm a tiny angel in Clipboard, so I was never a big investor there, much to my own chagrin. Obviously you have a situation where you have like a really exceptional driven founder. You have very clear dynamics around nursing shortages around the country and the need to staff efficiently. And then I think many of these types of vertical SaaS or vertical labor markets both have positive network effects once they get going. And the question is, can you get them going? But then also have follow-on monetization approaches that could exist via fintech related approaches. And so often the earliest products can really scale in terms of other ancillary things that you can cross-sell effectively. So I just felt that they had, really strong characteristics and they were growing really well and the founder was really good. And, I just viewed it as a very positive overall thing and, just really smart people doing interesting work.
That's a great summary. I have a third example, which is also a question on the strategy. So you mentioned like you build conviction in a product market that's going to emerge. My question is, what role does timing play? Because oftentimes when a product market becomes obvious to many people, there's lots of competition, and so take the payroll space, right? You invested in Deal, in Rippling, in Gusto, like all fantastic companies, but there's a dozen or two other competitors. So it's maybe a two-part question, which is one, like what role does timing play in identifying the product market? And the second question is, even when you're investing, there's going to be inevitably some competition. So how do you choose the winners, even when you have conviction that a product market is going to be, a mature, large market?
Yeah, I think maybe there's two separable things. Like there's all sorts of times where I wasn't actively looking for a product market, but founders came to me with something really interesting. And I think that's the majority case, right? Like I think the thousands of smart founders around the world will come up with much better ideas than I will, right? Now, every once in a while, there's a theme that I just think is interesting. Oh, generative AI seems super interesting. Let me dig around areas that seem promising. Or, 2017, I was like, oh, crypto seems really interesting. What are the companies that are the most interesting ones to exist that don't exist yet that I should get involved with or try to find, right? So sometimes there are things that are just kind of clear thematically, but often it's just like people come up with great ideas. And then in hindsight, you're like, oh shit, this is a trend, right? So I invested in Airtable, Notion, and Retool, all under the assumption these were just really smart people doing interesting things in interesting markets versus, oh, there's this no code, low code thing, right? In hindsight, there's no code, low code, but at the time it's just interesting, smart people working in good areas. So, and then I think there's a separate question, which is your market timing question. And obviously there are certain things that can't exist without technology dislocations, right? Harvey AI, which is focused on the legal vertical for, using generative AI for that couldn't exist without generative AI. Because people tried different forms of NLP and sort of older school approaches to doing legal document markup or other things, and it just never worked well enough for at least complex document types. Maybe you could do NDAs, but you couldn't do most other things. And then suddenly generative AI enables it and it unlocks stuff. The flip side of it is you probably could have done like an online payroll solution for a long time. And there were different attempts on it, but the attempts were just never well done, right? Or they didn't quite meet the user need, or, they still included an enormous amount of manual labor. So there wasn't that much point to it. And so I think there are some ideas that could have existed before that just, for some reason, nobody did them for a while. Uber was a good example, which only could have existed due to the iPhone. Because when I was working on mobile at Google, the carriers used to charge $1 for every GPS lookup you did. And then they'd say, hey, look, nobody wants to use GPS because nobody's using it. And you're like, yeah, it costs $1 every time you ping a server.
That's insane.
And so
that is so expensive.
Yeah, so if you were to do a trace of an Uber going down the street, it would cost you like, $100 by the time the Uber gets to you, just in terms of GPS. Look, it just wasn't economic to do these things, right? And when the iPhone came out, part of the brilliance of what Steve Jobs was he negotiated effectively package deals for developers for these types of access to telecom services that before were piecemeal doled out, and which carriers claimed nobody wanted to use. And the reason nobody wanted to use it was because it's expensive and it was impossible to actually access. And so I think there's also things like that where there's a change in industry structure, there's a change in regulation, there's a change in what's capable technologically. And so I think many of the best businesses end up having an underlying why now to them because the why now accelerates adoption of that business. But I also think there are circumstances where companies could have existed before, but they just didn't. And, part of that may just be nobody thought of it, or part of it was, the right or wrong person showed up or didn't. It's kind of like, there's this great person theory of history, right? There's a question of, if you look at historical events as a just mass societal movement in a direction and it substantiates itself, or do you need a singular individual to push society or the world forward? And so it's like, what would the world have been like without Napoleon? Which is very different from, hey, would the Industrial Revolution happen no matter what, even if any individual who was involved with it would have disappeared, right? And the Industrial Revolution probably would have happened. The Napoleonic Wars, maybe not so much, right? And so, at least not in the way that they did. And so I think the same is true for technology, where most of technology is just trends of history substantiating themselves over time. And then in other cases, people pull things forward and make things either happen or not happen. And so Elon Musk, I think, is a good example of that in terms of space and electric cars, right? Those clearly were not things that were going to happen, right? Space was not happening. There was a bunch of rocket companies, but none of them quite worked. People have been trying for decades. And now we're actually creating a whole new industry around space that didn't quite exist before. The electrification of cars was considered like a silly thing that nobody was going to work on, right? All the automotive giants thought it was many, many decades away or years away. And that timeline got pulled up, right? And so I think sometimes you see people pull timelines forward. And so for a lot of technology trends, the question is, not necessarily when, but who, right? Or I should restate it. It's a combination of when and who. There are counter examples of that, like nuclear, which no singular person has shown up to do it yet. And simultaneously, maybe there was some individual in the 70s who was the mastermind who shut it down. I don't know, right? Maybe that was a generic societal trend that should have happened, or maybe it was a targeted campaign by a small number of people who prevented cheap, abundant energy from happening. And so I think that those are really interesting sort of questions.
Yeah, speaking of trends that maybe haven't materialized yet, or maybe will never materialize, I mean, for me, like crypto jumps to mind because it's been top of mind for so many of us. What's your take there? Is it a timing question? I mean, hard question is unknowable, but I'm just curious if you have any thoughts. Yeah.
I'd say that crypto already exists for certain types of things. And I view it from a use case perspective where, it's already a store of value. You look at Bitcoin, I think there's generational adoption of that over gold, for example, and it is a superior product to gold in many ways. I think Ethereum and certain aspects of DeFi are here to stay. And the recent crypto meltdowns actually showed that those were robust systems that are actually useful in different ways. So I think there's certain aspects of crypto that have already proven themselves out and that people are using at enough scale that, if tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people are using something, it's already made it. I don't know how many people own Bitcoin now, but I think it's at least in the tens of millions, if not more. So I think it's hard to argue, with that, with actual traction. And I think that use case is store of value mainly, right? There's speculative uses, et cetera, but it's mainly store of value. And then there's the entire web shift onto Web3 or whatever. And I was always skeptical of that because I think that really, if you look at what a blockchain is, it's a less performant database. And unless you need either certain information in the clear that everybody can see and audit, or you need to cryptographically secure certain things, then there's lots of drawbacks to using it relative to a traditional database. And obviously it's richer than that now. I'm oversimplifying on purpose to make a point. And I think you kind of have to ask, what are the use cases that are best served by the technology versus saying, the entire creator economy is going to shift onto the blockchain. You're like, well, certain types of art, like NFTs, but not the entire creator economy, just why? Like, why is it important for that to be on the blockchain versus in the traditional world? And so I think things got really overstated. And I think in general, you can always call a market peak in technology when LA media personalities show up. And that was like the FTX ads, and that was the creator economy stuff. Like every type of cycle, there's a creator economy thing that happened in the 2010s with mobile and social, where Lady Gaga was building her own social network, and there's all these things happening that were obviously not going to necessarily be that important. And then you had it in the late 90s with the first internet bubble. And then we had it with crypto and Web3. And anytime you see that, you're like, okay, that's a market peak.
I love that. That's such a great signal. So I want to transition to AI because it really feels like similar in some ways. I mean, so early in the cycle, there's a lot of excitement around it. In other ways, it feels entirely different. Either way, it feels like, the technology world has been like struck by a bolt of lightning. To your point about someone pulling the future forward, it really feels like that's what happened here. I'm curious, two questions. Like one, what's your reaction to this versus kind of the introductions of technologies, prior, crypto and the iPhone and other ones. And the second question is like, what are you excited about? Like it still feels like it's really early days. It's probably tens of millions of DAU, maybe 100 million. But like, what are you excited about when, if 5 billion people are using this, and what are the types of things that you see that you're, interested in bringing to life that would, help the world and be useful?
Yeah, I do think this is the next big computational platform shift. And so this is a new way of thinking about compute and how you write software and how you write applications and what those things can actually do. And usually when you have a shift like that, you have 3 or 4 changes that happen. Number one is the capabilities shift dramatically. Otherwise, it's not a platform shift. The UI changes. And right now we're seeing chat as one of the main types of UIs. I think there'll be other ones, but you tend to kind of morph the UI against the capabilities. Third is the people who are impacted both positively and negatively often overlap but are a different subset. And so it's almost like who's getting displaced by these things, or what type of approaches are being subsumed. And there's lots of verticals that you consider like email jobs, or I don't know what to call it, computer jobs, right? You're sitting at a laptop all day typing. All the typing jobs are being threatened by this in one form or another. And that could be legal and accounting, that could be certain aspects of coding, it could be all sorts of things, right? And so I think over time, this is really a big wave around the information economy and how information is dealt with. And that's the short run substantiation of this. I think there's a longer term, multi-decade substantiation where this probably bleeds into robotics and all sorts of other areas. And that's another huge step function in terms of what that means for the world. But at least over the next couple of years, it seems like it's a really a shift in terms of, certain types of like language and thinking and interactions. And, it eventually leads you down the rabbit hole of like, what does a world look like when everybody has an agent that represents them, that has local data context, that can, cryptographically authent and represent you. And you could be a person, it could be a company, it could be a country, right? And when you have these sort of agent to agent interactions, what does that really mean for software? Because right now we're in a world where, people, the primary modalities of interactions around commerce and society are person to person or person to software interactions. And eventually we're going to end up in a world where most of those interactions are going to be agent to agent. And so what does that mean in terms of, what the software world looks like, and what that, how does the world function and get governed in those sorts of contexts, So I think there's some reasonably big picture things coming from that perspective, but that's a much longer journey than the next couple of years, of course.
So we talked a little bit about how you pay a lot of attention to commercial potential, right, of a new technology in a market, and I think on the one hand, it's clear that AI is going to solve like really obvious use cases in a much more cost-effective way than hiring a human, for example. But on the other hand, I think some of the commercial business models and use cases are not yet totally proven out or even figured out. So how do you think about the commercial side of things and the business model side of things, given where we are today?
I think there's a lot of really good commercial models right now. So I don't know. I mean, I think Copilot is monetizing okay for GitHub. It seems like OpenAI is monetizing both ChatGPT and its API. Jasper is rumored to have hit like a good amount of revenue. You see other companies ramping really fast in terms of revenue bases or usage. So I would kind of take the other side of it and say, given how early we are with all this stuff, it's actually surprising the velocity of revenue that some companies have experienced. And therefore, it really shows this is a real thing. ChatGPT launched when? Like, I can't remember, September, October, something like that. That's like, what, 5 months ago, right?
Yeah, not very long.
The latest version of the prior version of Stable Diffusion came out when, like, I don't remember what that was, like July, August or something. And then very rapidly, 3 or 4 of the top 10 apps on the App Store were based on it, Lenza and other things like that. And they were monetizing like crazy, right? And then GPT-4 just came out. So I just think it's really early, and the degree of traction we've seen this fast, to me, proves the point of how big of a dynamic and shift this is.
Yeah, totally. I mean, even like Jasper, Copy AI, like even pre-Chat GPT, some of those companies like got to 10, 20, 30 million revenue super fast. So I think you're totally right.
We were talking a lot about kind of when talking about the like just the astonishing rate of growth of these companies. I know you're actively investing in the space. How do you think about that? Like, especially nowadays when there's a lot of funding, there's a lot of competition. Are there specific, layers of the stack you're interested in? Would love to hear about like how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, I'm interested in all layers. I think there's still really interesting things to be done at the sort of foundation model level. I think there's super interesting tooling. There's the Lang chains and Llama indexes of the world and stuff. And then there's, all the application layer stuff. And then separate from that, I think there are different types of APIs or products people are going to be building about different types of modality like voice and things like that. So I think there's tons to do. So I think it's the most exciting time in a very long, in like a decade or something in terms of technology innovation, maybe longer than that.
I know one of the things you've been thinking about and have written about is defensibility and building moats. And arguably most early stage companies have no moat, and it's something you just have to build over time and have a thoughtful approach to. What do you think that looks like for some of the front end AI products? Given it's like so early and it's a lot of it is like fairly quick to get a V1 out. So how do you think that's going to play out? And what is your advice to maybe a founder who's listening, who's got a cool, app and is trying to think about how to build a company around it?
Yeah, I think to your point, defensibility tends to be overstated early and then maybe understated late. Like you really need to build defensibility over time. But, if two people worked on something for 6 months and then they launch it, it's definitionally non-defensible unless somehow a network effect kicks in early or something else happens. And so, for SaaS, that was true. For certain types of consumer products, that was true for a variety of different areas. And so I think people tend to overstate it. And for some reason, eventually people came to peace with that for SaaS companies, right? Like Notion in the first 6 months was not defensible, and Retool in the first 6 months was not defensible, et cetera. And then those companies build really deep defensibility and over time through network effects or platform effects or multiple templates or integrations or whatever it may be. And so I think, or in some cases, deals, right? You just lock in a long-term multi-year contract with different parties. So I just think for some reason in AI, people have forgotten all that and they're reinventing what does defensibility mean and how should it be baked in up front? And, if you can build a wrapper around GPT, what do you do? And I think the reality is in many cases, it's about, can you become either some form of workflow tool, potentially human in the loop, so you have some iterative series of steps that are taken, or you integrate with certain types of other tooling, or you're working in a vertical where there's, not any incumbent and you can really create a new type of application. Like I think there's lots of opportunities for that. And so I think it's one of those things that's just somehow become this big overstated thing.
I love that. Elad, we have a couple of questions that we like to ask everyone at the end of every show. And the first one is around feedback. What's the most challenging or difficult feedback you've received, and how have you processed it and incorporated it moving forward?
Susanna, are you interviewing me to join your podcast? You're like,
we would be thrilled to have you.
Tell me what you're good at and tell me what you're bad at. And, I don't know. It's been a while since I've asked anybody to give me feedback, to be honest, which I'm happy about. I think fundamentally, there's two types of feedback that you get in your career. There's feedback that is correct, and it may or may not land well, and it may or may not be something that you internalize, but it's actually correct. And it tends to be something that you get from multiple people over time. And, and often you should adjust to it. But I think one of the mistakes people make in their careers is that they, early in your career, you're always trying to fill out all the various aspects of the things you're good at and bad at. And in reality, you should probably be leaning into your strengths and then hiring or working with people who are complementary to you. And so I remember at Google, there was one person I worked with who's one of the best people managers I've ever seen in my life. He was ex-military background. He could motivate people. He could drive them. He was great at ops and details, and he was terrible at data and analytics. And he decided he really needed to prove himself as somebody who could go deep on data and analytics. And he took on all these projects, and he didn't do them as well as he could have because it just wasn't him, right? It wasn't not only his core skill set, it just wasn't something that he was as capable of doing as other people. And if I was him, I would have just grown a really large team and hired a really good data person, and eventually that's where he ended up. And so I think part of listening to feedback is understanding, is it feedback in terms of areas of improvement? Is it feedback in terms of how to work with people better? Is it something you can actually correct or not over time? And so I think that's one important consideration. There have been times where I've been given feedback like that, and it's been very useful. There have been times where people have given me feedback that I both didn't agree with, but I also felt was self-serving for the person giving it. And so you also have to ask, what is the motivation of the person? And why are they providing this feedback? And what is the dynamic underlying it? And are they feeling threatened by you? Or what are other dynamics at play? Are they trying to grab power from you? I had one manager who effectively was really upset because I was doing their job. They got hired in above me. And then when we go to meetings, people would ask that person if they were working for me. And that person got really upset about that and then tried to take me down. And so if you have situations like that, are you going to listen to that person's feedback? Are you going to say, wow, this is a political animal who's now trying to go after me? Right? And so I think over time, you just realize, you know what, sometimes there are people with bad agendas. Sometimes people are truthfully trying to help you and give you feedback that will help you grow. And then I think related to that, you need to ask, in what directions should I optimally grow over time? And what am I never actually going to be great at? I can get better at it and I'll learn how to get better at it. But there may be things that I'm never going to be great at, and that's okay. And so how do I make sure to complement that with others? Because I think startups or companies are a team sport, right? They're not solo sports. And so it's not about what can I do for everything? It's more like, how do I build a team of people around me that can create optimal outcomes or optimal output?
That's such a great answer. The last one is related to this, which is around your superpowers. We find exactly what you said. A lot of the guests we have on the show have acknowledged what they're amazing at, and they just lean on that day in and day out. I'm curious about you. What are the types of things that are your go-to superpowers that you find, give you leverage day to day?
I don't know. I think there's a handful of things that I'm reasonably good at. I think I'm good at doing high volumes of things rapidly. I'm reasonably good at identifying talent. And then I think there have been a number of examples where I've been able to effectively forecast or predict something with not a lot of data. And I should say, by the way, I have a lot of flaws. So, the flaws probably outweigh those things by far. So,
well, we all are all imperfect, and that's all good. But we really appreciate you coming on the show and talking about all sorts of things, and for being so patient. And thanks again. And look forward to having you on sometime in the future. Of course, you're always welcome to co-host with us. That opportunity is always available for you should you decide to take us up on it.
Well, I passed the interview, so I passed the interview question. Yeah, cool. Well, thanks so much for including me. Really appreciate it.